Now empty, the mob left David Ross there to search for any missing items and ensure no one returned. It turns out the 6 Mile Wayfarer house may not have been a hotel at all, and instead a hideout for outlaws and a gang of thieves that included the Fishers. The gang then returned that evening and attacked David Ross, kicking him out of the hideout, sending him back to town. According to a Charleston Courier article from February 22nd, 1819, the morning after David Ross was attacked, the gang stopped and attacked John Peoples, who was traveling towards Charleston. They beat him unmercifully and robbed him of any money he had on him. Upon entering the city, John Peoples went directly to the sheriff, who had also just heard the account of David Ross' attack. This caused the sheriff to gather a posse of armed men and head directly to the 6 Mile Wayfarer house, where they surrounded the house, demanding the Fishers surrender. Inside, the Fishers and 3 others were well armed with as many as a dozen muskets, but they were outnumbered and had no other choice but to surrender. The Fishers and their accomplices were then arrested, but not charged with murder since the investigation found no bodies in the house. There were no trapdoors or poisoned tea, but the police did find items belonging to several who said they had been robbed. Satisfied with their search, the sheriff burned down the 6 Mile Wayfarer house. The Fishers were charged with assault with the intent to murder, but this was then changed to highway robbery, which at the time was a capital offense, meaning the punishment was hanging. Excuse me. The Fishers did appeal their conviction, and like the legend, it was rejected. And like the legend, they did try to escape, but after the rope broke, John Fisher did not want to leave Lavinia behind and re entered the jail on his own accord. The two then wrote the governor many letters asking for a stay of execution. Other members of the community did the same, and by the time February of 1820 rolled around, the two were local celebrities. Many residents felt the punishment of hanging was far too harsh, and especially in Lavinia's case, as no woman had ever been sentenced to hang in the state. At first, the letters appeared to work, with the governor delaying the execution for 2 weeks. Lavinia believed this meant the governor was considering a pardon, or at the very least, taking execution off the table, but on the morning of February 18th, a carriage arrived at the county jail to take the Fishers to the gallows. Unlike the legend, Lavinia did not request to be hanged in her wedding dress and entered the carriage with John peacefully. Though once they arrived at the gallows, Lavinia did have to be dragged up the scaffolding as she yelled to the crowd that she was innocent. Once it was clear she would not be getting a pardon, she cursed the governor. She also didn't jump off the scaffolding, although her last words were the same. They came from anger at the governor as opposed to the callous evil the legend portrays it as. So if the true story of Lavinia Fisher is tamer and includes no murderous hotel, why are there countless variations to Lavinia's story, calling her America's first female serial killer? There's a lot of speculation about what caused the story of Lavinia Fisher to transform into one of murder, but in reality, it appears the story simply evolved over time due to the circumstances. Lavinia Fisher was the first woman hanged in Charleston during a time when it was extremely rare for a woman to be hanged in the country if it wasn't for murder. With it being a popular case, it's not surprising either that many a game of telephone played a game of telephone with the facts, changing the details as the years went on. It's not hard to see why someone not familiar with the actual details of the case would assume Lavinia must have also been a murderer. On top of that, with the 6 mile Wayfarer house being burned down, there were very few ways of disproving claims of trapdoors and buried bodies. Then the sightings started. The reports of Lavinia Fisher's ghost prior to 1886 staring out from the county jail are difficult to verify and were possibly created after 1886 to help give more credence to post 1886 sightings. It's also important to note that the late 1800s was the peak of the spiritualism in the United States. Belief in ghosts and spirits were high, and many believed it was entirely possible that ghosts of a foursome quote unquote serial killer would wander the streets. People began reporting seeing Lavinia Fisher's ghost wandering the Charleston County Jail today, known as the Old City Jail, in her wedding dress because the legend at this point had been twisted to include that she was hanged in it, yet we know she wasn't. Others have reported seeing her wandering the Unitarian cemetery, where the stories say she was buried. In reality, Lavinia would have been buried in a potter's field near the jail after she was hanged. She would have had no reason to wander the Unitarian cemetery. The ghost sightings and tales of her being a murderer created a feedback loop where many would report the sightings, adding their own twist to the story of the supposed murders. These stories were eventually reported in newspapers and magazines as fact, which then created more ghost sightings with more twists. By 1922, 100 years later, Lavinia was hanged. By 1922, 100 years after Lavinia was hanged, there were already magazines and newspapers like the Yorkville Inquirer calling Lavinia a murderer. At first, the stories reported upward of 20 bodies found buried in the 6 mile Wayfarer house. Today, after another 100 years, many giving ghost tours of the area report the number of bodies to be around 100, yet there were never any bodies buried under the home. It wasn't until recently that researchers started to take a close look at the legend and uh, started debunking the more fact. I'm losing my place here. It wasn't until recently that researchers started to take a close look at the legend and started debunking the more factistical elements of the story. In 2010, author Bruce Orr wrote the book 6 Miles to Charleston, the true story of John Lavinia Fisher, where using actual newspaper articles and other documents from the 1800s was able to disprove many of the made-up details of Lavinia Fisher's story. Today, you'll still hear the story of America's first serial killer who poisoned wandering travelers and led them to their deaths being reported as fact. Who knows how long it will take before the myths and legends are replaced by the true story. Lavinia Fisher wasn't a model citizen and was actually part of a violent gang that robbed travelers leaving Charleston, but she wasn't a murderer, and she certainly wasn't America's first female serial killer. There you have it. I want to give credit for this article, both parts, to faxology.com. Not sure if I did that in part one. There you go, guys. Just a good example of how things can get twisted, and often enough, what you end up hearing is nowhere near what actually happened. If you guys, anyone out there has anything they would like to add to this story, I would appreciate the email. Shoot it to Wayne at Paranormal World Productions. Also, any suggestions on anything you'd like for me to cover in the future. Ask everybody to please head over to paranormalworldproductions.com. Check out our website. Show some support to this show as well as Sasquatch Odyssey and True Crime Odyssey. All right. That's enough for this one. I guess I'm going to get out of here, guys. Remind everybody about Paranormal Odyssey Live, which can be found right here every Friday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, right here on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button, please. Paranormal Odyssey podcast, still releasing 2 new episodes weekly, every Wednesday and Sunday. All right, guys. Y'all be good to each other. Be good to yourselves. And I will catch you next time.